We've been talking about the fact that most of what our brain does is not only outside of our conscious awareness, but pretty much outside of our control. So what does this mean for responsibility?
Well, I think what it means is that when we look at something like the legal system, something like blameworthiness is actually the wrong question for us to ask. I mentioned before that brains end up being an end result of a very complicated process of genes intertwining with environment. So in the end, when there's a brain standing in front of the judge's bench, it doesn't matter for us to say, okay, well, are you blameworthy? To what extent are you blameworthy? To what extent was it your biology versus you? Because it's not clear that there's any meaningful difference between those two things anyway. So I'm not saying this forgives anybody. We still have to take people off the street if they're breaking the laws. But what it means is that asking the question of blameworthiness isn't where we should be putting our time. Instead, all we need to be doing is having a forward-looking legal system where we say, what do we do with you from here? We don't care how you got here because we can't ever know. It might have been in utero cocaine poisoning, childhood abuse, lead paint on the walls, and all of these other things that influence your brain development, but we can't untangle that, and it's not anybody's fault. It's not your fault or anybody else's, but we can't do anything about it. So all we need to do is say, given the kind of person you are now, what is the probability of recidivism? In other words, how likely are you to transfer this behavior to a future situation and reoffend? And then we can predicate sentence length on that probability of reoffense. And equally as importantly, along with customized sentencing, we can have customized rehabilitation. So there are lots of things that can go wrong with people's brains that we can usefully address and try to help people instead of throwing everybody in jail. As it stands now, 30% of the prison population has mental illness. Not only is that not a humane way for us to treat our mentally ill and make a de facto healthcare system, but it's also not cost effective. And it's also criminogenic, meaning it causes more crime. Because everybody knows when you put people in jail, that limits their employment opportunities, it breaks their social circles, and they end up coming back to the jail more often than not. So it's very clear how the legal system should be straightening itself out just to make itself forward-looking and saying, okay, all we need to do is get good at assessing risk into the future. Now, one caveat I need to make very clear is we will never be able to predict people's behaviors because life is too complicated and crime is contextual. You can take the exact same person and put him in different circumstances, and in one circumstance he'll thrive as a CEO, and in another circumstance he'll get arrested for 30 years for being a drug dealer, and it's the same person. It's just a matter of what neighborhood they found themselves in and what circumstances. So we're never going to be able to predict crime entirely. Nonetheless, it is the case that brains are not the same as one another, and some people are very dangerous. Some people are really bad seeds that prove themselves to be so over and over and are really violent and aggressive and don't have empathy for other people. At the other end of the spectrum, you have people who have ended up on the wrong side of the law for whatever reason, but they're not actually terribly dangerous for the future. Of course, this is a spectrum. You have everybody in between. The really important part is to figure out how can we get good at having good prediction about this stuff. As I said, it will never be 100% prediction. That's not even the goal. It's not even possible. But that's the goal, is to have a customized system.
We know free will is a non-starter philosophically and scientifically. Now, many people struggle not to admit this, but however our mental life is caused, it is caused either by prior causes or by some randomness intruding, but whether it's purely deterministic or there's determinate causes combined with some randomness, neither offer a space for free will to operate. I mean, just imagine if all of your experience were caused by someone at a computer just determining what you feel and do and say and want. That's clearly not a circumstance of free will. Now imagine if that person just was determining in all of that, but 10% of the time threw some dice or introduced some other mode of randomness into the process. That doesn't open up a space for free will. And we know, just as a matter of scientific fact, that everything you're consciously intending to do and wanting to do and judging to be good or bad is preceded by neural events of which you're not conscious and of which you are not the author. We walk through life feeling that we're the conscious author of our thoughts, but you can't think a thought before you think it. So here's an experiment in free will. Think of a famous person. So do you have a famous person in mind? Well, why didn't you think of another famous person? I mean, you can't account for, if you thought of Ricky Gervais, you can't account for why you didn't think of Eddie Izzard. And that goes for every other move you might make that's starkly voluntary. Things simply spring into consciousness. Now, the reason why this is not morally important is what we condemn in other people is not the fact that they really are the ground cause of their actions. What we condemn are intentions to do harm, and intentions are still part of the causal framework. I mean, I only reach for this water because I intend to reach for it. I want to drink it. It's not like I can just sit back and wait and see what happens. And the only way to get to the water is to intend to drink it. And so what we condemn in an evil murderer is not the fact that he truly and really and metaphysically is the source of his action. I mean, all these evil murderers have either bad genes or bad parents or bad lives or bad ideas or some combination thereof, and they're not the author of any of those things.
So free will is an arrogance on the part of man, the assumption that he is the only object in the world that does not react to certain stimuli. All decisions are based upon whatever reaction you had. If you like a young lady, you get married. In the old days, you just moved in together. But it was too difficult to manage. That is, a ruling group of people could not manage people unless they made a set of laws and said, you don't take anything out of his hut, you don't take anything out of her hut. They had to invent some kind of structure to keep that society from working. In other words, if everybody took things from your log cabin and you went hunting and you got 5 rabbits and I stole 4 of them, the tribe wouldn't work. So morality is an outgrowth of inability to manage systems. Do you understand that? All moral laws come about because we need to have, especially if you get more than 4 people living together, you have to make laws. The laws that don't take his bow and arrow, he made that bow and arrow. You give him all kinds of words, it's wrong, this is... but if a guy doesn't have a bow and arrow or a javelin, and a lion comes at him and your javelin is nearby, he will borrow it. He doesn't steal it, he borrows it and he throws it at the lion. Because that's the only thing he knows that'll keep the lion off. He said, I decided to take your javelin, although I know it's yours, but there was nothing else I could do at the time. So the judge might be lenient. Now a lenient judge is a broad judge with broader experience. A judge that's brought up to believe in right, wrong, good, bad, black and white, his decisions are rigid as hell. But if he goes to another country that has a different set of values and he learns to live there, he can understand when you say different cultures impose different values on people.
How is it that we want our social system to operate? What makes criminal behavior? What are the factors that make a Jeffrey Dahmer? I'm sure you know who that was. Before Jeffrey, there was Albert Fish. I don't know if any of you remember Albert Fish. Albert Fish was a fine-looking gentleman. He ate 45 children. Well, you wonder, how can anyone do that kind of thing? I'm going to try to give you some idea of the background of Albert Fish. When he was a youngster, about 10 years old, he was touching his private parts. His mother was an old-time Baptist, and she says, you are going straight to hell. You will burn eternally. And that kid, Albert Fish, stuck needles into his genitals because he didn't want to burn in hell. And he took other children into empty lots and cut off their private parts because he wanted to save them. If you're brought up in a distorted environment, which we all live in today, any judge that raps the gavel and says 30 years is an ignoramus because he has no idea of the factors that shape human behavior.
From 1991 until last year, a handful of top security prisoners volunteered for psychotherapy with a prison psychiatrist. They agreed to allow him to videotape the actual treatment, and over 700 hours of interview were recorded. These extraordinary sessions reveal important insight into the predators, some of the most explosive inmates in prison today. These tapes are a unique record of a group of violent men who are psychopaths, men who suffer from severe personality disorders. Every country has them. No one really knows how to deal with them. They often kill or inflict terrifying and pointless violence, yet psychopaths are not classified as insane. They're manipulative and cunning, and they lack all remorse for their criminal behavior. For years, government reports have agonized on how to define and handle these people. Men who, even in captivity, are so serious a menace that the special hospitals don't want them. So they remain brooding in dangerous isolation in prison until their eventual release. Parkhurst Prison, once top security home for some 18 predators. Here, psychiatrist Dr. Bob Johnson was invited by the governor to try out a unique experiment for these men. Johnson was convinced that he could break the mold and actually treat and possibly cure these notoriously antisocial men.
The reason that they are so antisocial is that they really don't care. They have been taught they are of no consequence, they have no self-esteem, and they don't believe that any other human being is of any merit or value at all. So therefore they are quite comfortable with the notion that if you cut people up and chop them up or put them through the mincer, which is what you hear, and these people are quite capable of doing that, they register no feelings. They have no value system there because they've never been taught any value system.
Lenny Lee, one of Johnson's earliest patients, a petty criminal, a drifter with no violent background. Suddenly and without reason or provocation, he exploded into violence, battering a friend to death. Michael Donnelly, Lee's friend. Lee killed him by dropping a door on top of him and stamping him to death.
The toilet taps, it had windows in it and that. And I drew a line in the dirt. I said, right, Mick, see if you can walk a straight line along there. Now, I'm going to laugh now, but I'm not laughing at what I did. It's just that it's just crazy. So as he's walking along the line, I give him a right hook, and he falls on the floor. Anyway, he called me a bastard, so I went to town on him. Now, I said to the police that it took me about 6 or 7 hours to kill him. It didn't. It just happened in a flash. You know what I mean? But I must admit, He was dead when I left the flat. When I left the house, he was dead. He wasn't alive. But it was a strange murder. And so I'm thinking, well, I'm not pleading. When he catch me, I know we're going to get caught. I got grassed up anyway, but I had to tell somebody. And when I got caught, the police said to me, said it to me twice, the superintendent. He says, did you mean to kill him? And I never answered. And then he says, what was you saying when he was killing him? I said, I'm going to kill you, you bastard. 3 times. And I did.
Dr. Johnson's starting point in therapy with men like Lee was that predators are not born evil, they simply learn to become evil, often from childhood trauma they've never talked about before.
I would sit down with them, get to know them first. This is the first thing. I would establish a trusting, straightforward relationship with them, something many of them had never had before. And this took a long time in some cases, a matter of years. And then I would discuss with them the deepest fears they'd had, the fears from childhood, the traumas they'd suffered, things that they would not wish to talk about at all. That was the key. There was a terror in childhood that they blocked off. I used to call it frozen terror or buried terror. Every single one. They wouldn't all reveal it. They wouldn't all discuss it. Some discussed it sort of indirectly or moved themselves. But there's no question in my mind now that inside every memory there was a toxic memory, which is this terror.
Darren Blanchflower, a 28-year-old from Norwich, was serving 5 years for armed robbery and wasn't considered a dangerous prisoner. Yet he became one of Johnson's most menacing patients. Norwich Prison, 1990. Blanchflower was in for armed robbery when he met a civilian decorating instructor, Walter Arnold. Arnold criticized the standard of Blanchflower's work and in doing so unwittingly signed his own death warrant.
I took the hammer out and attacked him. I hit him about 6, 7 times. He didn't go down. He tried to defend himself, but he didn't stand a chance. He was facing me by this time, and I carried on hitting him. Top of the head. He went down, and he ended up laying on the side of his face. I carried on hitting him all over the side of his face. The other guy was hearing the screams and came out and shouted to me. Now I stopped, stood back, looked, just carried on hitting.
Wow.
You know, now I know that is how calm I was, because if that was a frenzy, as soon as he would have shouted at me, in most cases I would have stopped. I would have dropped that hammer. And I thought, Jesus, what have I done? What have I done? But I didn't.
Blanchflower was sentenced to life and shortly afterwards volunteered for treatment with Dr. Johnson on Sea Wing. At first he himself seemed to confirm Bridget Murphy's opinion of his evil character.
I'd said after the first murder that I'd kill again. And I realised, part of me realised I weren't enough. I mean, one reason because I think at that time a part of me wanted to kill again. A part of me weren't satisfied with one. I just think a part of me just weren't satisfied with it. I wanted to get another one.
It took 9 months of intense therapy for a more mature Blanchflower to talk about significant events from his childhood.
My mum bought me a rabbit, yeah? A pet rabbit. Playing with it and all that. And I started starving it, I wouldn't feed it. So I used to watch it. Let it out in the back garden. My mum's round her friends having a cup of tea. I've got the spade. I've cut it in half. Buried it, put a crossing, went next door crying. Said, I found Snowy dead. And I said, in its cage. And Mum said, oh, all right. She said, I'll buy you another one. I said, no, I don't want another one. She said, don't want that one. But I killed it, I cut it in half.
When you were 10?
Buried it. Buried it in the garden.
Incredible.
You know, things like that. Then we had an old mantle. I put like frogs and stuff in there and crush it, watch it explode and all that.
Jeez.
It was fascinating. You know, crush it, you know, turn the cogs around, just 60.
I was very persistent. I was convinced that they had a terror inside them, though they denied it. They said, no, there's nothing there at all. So I would say, no, I think there is. Let's talk about your father, let's talk about your mother, let's talk about what it is. I'm looking for fear and terror from childhood, let's have it. And because I was persistent, and because I went right up to them with my personality and said, look, I'm going to talk to you about this, tell me about it, they began eventually to trust me, and they began, most of them, to unblock this and discuss it.
Johnson discovered that Blanchflower saw serious problems in his relationship with his mother. Typically for a psychopath, he expressed violent fantasies about her.
She will suffer. I can't be physically because I'm in here. If I was outside, she would suffer physically. I would make her pay. I mean, I'm just telling you the truth because that's how it is. I would hurt her more than I've hurt anyone, and believe me. I'm not talking about the murder now either. I have hurt people.
But just before you get on to that, the case that I'm trying to make is that by directing so much of your energies and your emotions still at your mother, this indicates to me that your mother has more role in your mind than she should have. You should be totally cold with your mother.
I am cold with her.
That's not cold, that's hot the other way.
No, that's cold to me.
By forcing Blanchflower to confront and diffuse these childhood memories, Johnson believes he saw evidence of a real change in his patient.
Perhaps my days of violence are over.
You're thinking that?
Yeah, perhaps they're finished now.
Wow.
Perhaps I don't need to. I don't need to solve an argument or solve a problem by hurting people. I can solve it by talking. But even in an argument, I feel now that I could have an argument with somebody or something and not lose my temper.
Amazing.
Whereas before I came here, that wasn't possible. If I had a problem, I had to deal with it, and the only way I could deal with it was through violence.
Right.
Is he just saying these things to please you?
He is pleasing himself. It's quite remarkable. This is way into the therapy again. This isn't early stuff. Initially, he said, I was born evil, born violent, and he believed that. There was no hope of change. Here, he knows now that he's changing. He knows that there is an alternative. There is a more fruitful social life possible. Very important.
Predators like Blanchflower, bad but not mad, are currently the subject of a vigorous debate within forensic psychiatry. Are they generally difficult to treat and incurable, as has always been believed, Or is Dr. Johnson's work pointing in another direction? How do you know they weren't conning you? Psychopaths are amongst the greatest manipulators in the world.
Right. The first answer to that is they didn't know what the questions were I was asking. They didn't want to think about the areas I wanted to talk about. And I persuaded them to, and eventually they did. That's the first thing. So they didn't know which way to con to begin with. They didn't know which line to take. Secondly, they changed in outlook. They changed visually. You could see the body language changed. They cheered up. They stopped sleeping badly. They stopped getting these stomach pains. They stopped hitting each other. They were cheerful. They started taking education courses. The whole personality, the whole outlook on life changed.
And you think that that may be permanent?
Indeed.
Johnson believes one of his most dramatic successes was with Patrick Kelly, a 31-year-old Glaswegian with a long history of violent assaults. When he was just 18, he'd repeatedly stabbed a casual acquaintance to death.
Caught him like that, poked him, like that, stabbed him up here. The guy collapsed, I picked him up. I says, right, I says, don't scream, don't holler, nothing. Nothing else is going to happen to you. I'm just going to pick you over the fence and just leave you there. You can get him that way. We got him over the fence, he started freaking, help, help. I says, aye, fucking something help now, mate, crash. Just stabbed him with the football. Well, I says, yeah, you no longer hit me, you bastard. You know what I mean?
The victim, Thomas Thompson. Once again, Johnson looked for explanations in Kelly's early childhood. It also became clear that behind Kelly's aggression lay a deep insecurity.
He was known in the prison as a knife man and had, in fact, committed some very savage attacks. He did none of this on Seawing, I'm happy to say, and the reason for this knife defence, as you might say, was because he felt very insecure and he had some very serious problems that we needed to address.
Not least was Kelly's obvious enjoyment of the violence he inflicted with his knife.
When I walked towards him, I says, I see the cut. I thought I'd cut him. What? I says, part of me sees myself. So when I see the cut, before I've cut him, I know where my blade's going.
But after 2 years, Johnson uncovered what he believed was the frozen terror in Kelly when his patient told stories of being sodomized in childhood.
The first time it happened to me, Bob, I was 4 years of age. I was walking out of the bathroom, going to the lounge or the living room. I was that fucking devastated, numb, shocked, scared, lost, bewildered, everything. Now that's what came out over there. Wow. That's what came out over there.
Wow.
You know what I mean?
Jeepers.
And they're turning around and saying, yeah, you can be angry, but it don't give you a fucking cause to go and hurt someone over it. Well, I'm afraid you're all wrong in that score.
I'm afraid she is.
I'm afraid, I'm sorry, but I'm afraid they're wrong in that score. Yeah. You know?
Yeah. No, I'm afraid that's the wrong way to do it. Jeepers. Well, it's not surprising, is it? I haven't used it.
I'm all right,
Oh, they're there anyway. Bloody hell. And I'll tell you something else. If she's...
I might start hunting back, Bob.
Oh, that's the thing.
I'm telling you, mate, I might hunt back. I can't fucking love doing this, Bob. I've been hurt too much. I've been hurt. I fucking loved him, Bob. I just wanted to tell him I loved him. That's all I wanted to tell him.
Every single major criminal that I talked to had this kind of painful memory driving them to destruction. And the only remedy is to establish a trusting relationship so that they can discuss it.
Because the point about the Kelly we've seen previously is that he's a deeply unattractive person.
Very destructive, and no redeeming features. But he saw no redeeming features in the world around him. Now he's beginning to. Now he has got an atmosphere in which he can discuss the most painful things in his memory and adjust to the reality that this will not recur.
Prolonged therapy did eventually tease out of even Smitherman something Johnson interpreted as a hint of a desire for a better life than endless killing.
See, what I done is stand out and kill as many people as I want, and then I call it 9 to me.
I'm not going anywhere. I don't think they're crazy enough to, at this moment, to let me fucking out. I'm not killed too many people. So another one, you know what I mean? But I don't want to do that.
No, I understand that. I understand that. What I'm saying is this: let's us.
I want to change my life, man. I don't want to be violent, aggressive, and crazy.
Listen to what he says. I don't want to be violent and aggressive. I want to get the hatred out of my mind. Why does he say that? Because that's the bottom line. This again is long into therapy, must 12, 18 months down the line. Wrestling with him, saying there is a different view of life, people are friendly, people are sociable. He basically wants to be a human being like anybody else. And that's the evidence.
Because we've heard a great deal of violence from him, haven't we?
Correct. Correct. And that is imposed, in my view, that's what he's trained to do. Violence is a learned disease. That's what he's been trained to do.
Johnson's theories may sound simplistic, yet while he was at Parkhurst, he says his psychopaths reduced their tranquilizer intake by 95% and levels of violence on the wing were reduced to near zero.
When I started, I wasn't sure which way it would go. But over the period of time, it worked 100%. 100%, that is, for those who I could establish this trust with, those that I could get, start unpacking their boxes in their heads. There were failures because the people backed off. They didn't dare pursue.
Truth is the reality of the situation. Truth is a pragmatic description for that, definition of that, which is that everybody has a mental image of the world about them, and the truer it is, there's no can never be absolute because it's a model. The truth, it becomes truer the more accurate the model, so you have to keep checking. So that's the truth, and the truth is you're an adult and you have infant emotions which have been frozen and need melting so they can change. Trust is the antidote to fear. If you haven't got trust, you can't begin. And consent is crucial because that's how you control your own mental furniture. It's childhood fear which distorts the perception in childhood, and so you get into adult life and you're misperceiving the world around you. Fear prevents you thinking straight. It prevents you trusting, and it prevents you from believing things. Now you remove the fear and all those three can be repaired. What happens is the child is growing up, something dreadful happens, shall we say, and they freeze at that age. So what happens is that they continue through life, they grow up, but in their own mind they're still 4, or they're still 2. And often I would discuss with the prisoners, talk about their parents, and they would look up. So in their imagination, the parent is still 3 or 4 times their size. That's in their memory, it hasn't changed. And the thrust of the therapy is to say, look, you believe that the trauma is still going on in your head. It's my task to convince you it isn't. The normal, healthy human mind is lovable, social, non-violent. If you get deviations from that, whether in passive symptoms like hearing voices or anorexia or whatever you want, or you get aggression and you're out there hitting people or killing people or whatever it is, that shows a disturbance of the fundamentally healthy socializing function, and that needs treatment. It start off in nursery, primary school, secondary school, parenting classes, parenting support groups, middle age, old age, right away through. We're actually a sociable species, and it should be implemented as a sociable species. And we get delight from social interaction, and that should be demonstrated and encouraged.
I very much disagree with that notion that there is an us and a them. I just see an us. I just see kind of these people have not had the same chances and opportunities, an investment more than anything else in themselves and confidence to actually go on and make a life for themselves.